Okay, we are recording. Okay, so in an ideal world at this point, we should have potentially already interviewed 3 individuals. However, I know that that varies based on student. So I want to start off this session by saying if there are any extenuating circumstances at all, like class is very much based on human interaction and human engagement for only this part of the needs assessment assignment. Then from this point on, you are pretty much, proposing a logic model, proposing a program evaluation, but the only engagement that you need from 3 outside individuals is really for this needs assessment. So every once in a while, students are like, my 3rd social worker flaked on me, or, the teacher I was going to interview canceled. Can I have an extension based on that? And I always say yes. However, just communicate with Brandon and I and let us know early if this is shaping up to be the case. Okay, so let's say, you're just having trouble contacting people. I'm currently doing a needs assessment with substance use disorder treatment providers in Los Angeles County. I am having a really hard time getting people to return my phone calls because people are really short staffed. So trust me, I'm in the same boat as you are. Ideally, you should not delay this assignment because the logic model comes very quickly after this assignment, and then students as a trend tend to get behind. But just know, like, research world does not always align with, the deadlines of this class. So just know that, Brandon and I are flexible. Just reach out and email us early on. So I wanted to really go over the components of this assignment and tell you some of my general feedback from previous years. So this assignment really has 5 sections. So first is the overview, second is the project partners, third is the interview guide, fourth is the themes, and fifth is the findings. And so findings is really implications, and also you need to identify the program that you want to implement. So it all kind of builds this assignment to the finding section. So I'm going to go over some common sort of pitfalls of each section. So the overview section really requires you to do a few things. You need to clearly identify your population of focus. So I'm going to give you some examples of students in the past and what they've done. So I've had students do population of focus being African-American college students, LGBTQI+ community, middle school age youth struggling with social and emotional learning. I've had youth aging out of foster care. So these are all population focused needs assessments. I've also had people do needs assessments of an organization. So that would be potentially child welfare workers. I've had students do Kent School of Social Work, MSSW online students. So that's bounded within an organization. I've had students do transportation workers. So that all work for a certain organization. So you can see the differences between, a population out in the community versus a population bounded within an organization. So within that, you need to clearly provide a rationale for the needs assessment with supporting literature that backs up your intention. So this is where the first pitfall, in my opinion, lies, is that sometimes students give a great rationale for their needs assessment, but they don't ground it in literature. So this is the process in research where we talk about iteration. So we are always going back and forth between what we think we know about our population of focus and what's in the literature. So let's say I am doing a needs assessment on middle school age youth struggling with social and emotional learning. And I know there's a need there, let's say based on my practicum site. I see that students are struggling with these skills. So I know that from my lived experience, but I should also back that up by, going into Google Scholar or other search engines and saying, well, what is the literature saying about struggles among middle school age youth with social and emotional learning? And that way you can really combine, your practice knowledge with the literature and citational evidence, meaning that, we have APA citations in that first section. We don't need them in all of the sections, but this first section for sure. So any questions about the overview section, section 1, before I move on? Okay, and feel free to stop me at any time as I'm going through this. So the second is pretty straightforward. That's our project partners. This is usually a slam dunk for most students, because what I'm asking you to do is just tell me who your project partners are. Who are you focusing on? What are their different roles? So that I can gain a sense of the overall needs from different perspectives. So just a pro tip, you all have pretty much already written this section in one of your previous assignments. That's when you wrote in your journal for Brandon and I, like, these are the 3 people I intend to interview. This is my interview plan. I do not care if you copy and paste that into this project partner section. Just a common pitfall, some of our students, and I know that this is really challenging because the Royce book is a little bit dated, tend to replace project partners with the term stakeholders. And just, according to the CDC's new 2020 guidelines, which we read week 1, stakeholders is no longer a term being used as requested by tribal communities. So this is where we just use project partners instead. So we're going to use those new CDC guidelines. So the section 2, that's typically the only pitfall that I really see there. Students usually get full points for that section. Section 3 is your interview guide. And so what is a little bit tricky about this, but not really, I think if we break it down, it's easy, is that I want to see your interview guide, but I also want you to include literature which informed the development of your interview guide. So let's take the example of middle school students who have a need for increased education on social and emotional learning. I would anticipate when developing your interview guide, so like your 10 or so questions to interview, let's say, teachers about middle school students' social emotional learning, you would look at the literature to see maybe how to organize that interview guide, kind of more iteration. So what are sort of the categories of social learning? What are the categories of emotional learning? How do I really inform my interview guide with literature? How did that help develop it? So you should have some citations in this section as well. So any questions on the interview guide section or the project partner section? And some of you, I've already seen your interview guide. So if you are all, hopefully you've already utilized your interview guide and hopefully you found 3 participants to interview. But if not, and you're still struggling on that development of that, feel free to send a copy of it to Brandon and I, just with kind of your needs assessment topic, and we can give you feedback on that. So the methodology behind this course is that every journal assignment should build to our big culminating assignments. So 2 more sections, which are really the biggest sections of this. So next is our themes. So last week, our video with Dr. Brene Brown sort of showed you a way that her work as a researcher kind of cut through all the interview data that she has collected over the years to find this acronym of braving, and every letter stood for a different part of braving that had to do with the anatomy of trust. So in a similar way, I want you to interview 3 people, and then using all the coding strategies from week 4. And then today I posted another video with more what's called second cycle analytic strategies. You are then going to try to identify 3 themes that cut across all interviews to really try to identify the needs for your needs assessment. So the one thing I want to alert you to is that in the assignments tab, there is a really great example of a needs assessment assignment from a previous year. And I want you to all take that in and to read that and use it as a guide. The one limitation to the needs assessment based on that student's work is that they did not ground the data, meaning they did not include quotes. So what I'm asking for you to do in this section is I want you to present your theme, but I want you to also show me quotes that support your theme. So that's how you effectively render your data in themes. But I would like you to also, it helps Brandon and I when we're grading this, to write an introductory section where there's a clear listing of your themes. So within the needs assessment and my interviews with, a social worker, a clinical supervisor, and a director, I identified the following themes: X, Y, and Z. And then you can go through the themes.
Did the quotes come from our interviews? I want to make sure I understood that right.
Yes. So let me give you an example of what that might look like. So I did an interview today, right before this class, with a substance use disorder treatment provider in Los Angeles. And one of my questions to her was how, what types of clients is your program best optimized to serve? And she responded that they do really well with populations experiencing homelessness. That's what she thinks they're specialized in. She said they did really well with populations who are formerly incarcerated. So in my notes, I'm like, okay, so let's say I hear that across all 3 participants I interviewed. I'm going to say, oh, these 3 programs were best optimized to serve participants experiencing homelessness and participants who are formerly incarcerated. For example, let me give her a code name. So Jennifer reported, I believe we are best optimized to serve these clients. And so I'm actually pulling a quote from that interview and placing it in the paper. So that's oh, sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, I'm losing my voice.
Go ahead.
So like when I do my interview, and I've talked to a couple people, and they said because we don't have a sober living facility for women in the area that I live in. And the girls that are graduating the treatment program are wanting to stay in this area. So just based off them saying they wish there was sober living in this area, I can just use that as a quote for the need. Okay.
Yeah, so you can identify the theme as being more abstract than that. So saying maybe across all 3 participants, the need was identified that they're like housing or so residential care. So you can say theme 1 was residential care. For example, across all 3 participants, they said there was no regional sober living facility, and that is a need. So for example, Anita said, and then you put in, let's say Anita is your participant's code name, you put in that. And then Sarah said this. So you're just giving Brandon and I a taste of like what's called your raw data. In qualitative research is like we want to hear your participants' very words sprinkled throughout your theme section. Any other questions on the theme section?
This may be like a kind of dumb question, I guess.
No,
but I noticed,
there's no such
said,
thing.
you said like to code the names. Like if they're professionals, do you want us to still like make code names, or should we not use the real names? Is that what you're kind of hinting at?
Yes, yeah. So it's usually best practices and program evaluation or research that there's some sort of anonymity or confidentiality, even though this isn't a formal research process. It's good to get in the habit of that. So like, let's say you all go on to become professional program evaluators. It's really challenging when you go back to the organization and you present to them things that various employees said, because it can have consequences on people's jobs. So I would say give them all a code name. Sometimes I let my participants choose their code names, but if you've already done the interviews and you haven't done that, feel free to just give them a code name.
So is it too late if we wrote in our last journal the actual names of the project partners?
No, it's okay. It's okay. Because the only people that have seen that are Brandon and I. So don't worry about it. You can just give them a code name for this next version of the assignment. I've even had people say participant A, B, and C. You can do that too. Or I like sometimes when students are like social worker 1, or social worker A, social worker B, client A. So that way I can also attach, if you're interviewing people that are at different levels of the organization, then I can see who's saying what.
So there's no way to put like, Bugs Bunny or Betty Boop or.
You could do that too. You could do that. Brandon and I worked on a study together and somebody chose their name to be Baby Bug. And that was always like one of my favorite code names ever. So you can do that. Any other questions on the themes? It's really kind of about organization, if anything. So it's first identifying the themes that tend to be more abstract. So let's say things like housing, things like clinical supervision, things like, let's say household food insecurity. And then you just show us how these themes are linked to your interview data. Your participants' very words in quotes. Okay, and then the last part is really kind of the culmination, and it's really the lifting part to the next assignment. So it's the launch pad that gets us to the logic model and gets us to the program evaluation, is that you're going to use the wisdom that you have gathered from interviewing your clients and putting together your needs assessment and looking across the different themes of the needs that you've identified. And you're going to talk to us about implications for practice. And then you're going to try to think about the program that you've identified to implement. So let's use the example of a sober living facility, because that was a really great example that was brought up. Is that, you've learned that there's these implications for practice by identifying the need. So you're going to actually identify the program. So let's say that is the implementation of a sober living facility in my area, because the literature shows that this is often linked to successful outcomes for treatment for women because of X, Y, and Z. And this is also grounded in the data that I've collected from my 3 participants. So you want to have those kind of implications for practice. And I also want you to identify some challenges with implementing such a program. So it's like really cool to be able to lay the framework and look about what's possible for the future program. But I also want you to think about like, what are some of the limitations that could challenge? That could be funding, because that then links us to the logic model, which is next, where we actually need to think about the resources needed to actually have a successful implementation of that kind of program.
Could that even be like where you would place the facility at? Because I know in our area, like people are against, there's still that stigma attached to it. So they don't even want to set in their neighborhood. Like,
Yeah.
So that poses a big challenge for us.
Yeah, I would say, stigma is definitely a challenge that, that derails lots of different housing and residential programs. And so, yeah, that would be a really important barrier to identify, especially if you can have data showing that and supporting that as well from your interviews.
So if funding is like one of the main things of why adults from 18 to 25 don't have inpatient mental health facilities, they usually only go up to like ages 17 and then they're out on their own. So if funding's a part of it, like would I go in detail with literature to
No,
explain it?
I wouldn't go too deep with the challenges in your your findings. You're looking at implications for practice, and you're looking at sort of proposing this program. And I would say maybe in 1 or 2 sentences say, the potential challenges linked to this, which came across in my interviews, were funding. Let's say that. But to the next assignment, the logic model, we sort of suspend our thinking about that, where we look at just the resources we need to implement the program, but we're really engaging in like magical thinking for the next 2 assignments, where like there are no barriers. We just need to identify the resources. Okay, so let me see if I can find any last steps for that last section, the finding section. I find it very confusing because when I think of themes is really in research land. So like in all the qualitative journal articles that you find, themes are your findings. Like those are the same things. Like you have a results/finding section and your qualitative data goes under that. But for whatever reason, findings in this is really implications for social work practice, for your identified program, or for the service recipients. And then it really says, like, we want you to identify the program or service you want to implement for your next assignment. And then you're just looking a little bit at the limitations of your research and how you would address those limitations in the future. So limitations for your research can be things like, I would love to have interviewed a client. However, I didn't really have access to a client that I didn't have a conflict of interest with. So what we don't want you to do for this assignment is interview your own clients. If for whatever reason you have access to a person who is receiving services at an organization, great. And they are willing to talk to you, wonderful. I've had really great program evaluations where there is client voice. But we just, don't want you to interview one of your own clients. So sometimes that's a limitation. Maybe you didn't get people across like different levels of the organization. You interviewed 3 social workers. That's fine. Just think about maybe 1 or 2 things that in an ideal world you could have achieved, but you weren't able due to, the time constraints of this assignment. Brandon, do you have anything else to add that I'm missing?
You trying to wake me up over here?
No, you look awake to me.
No, I think you've covered everything. And I'm taking notes because I think I'm learning things myself.
Okay, good. I think students tend to lose points on this assignment if they do not include literature. I know that's something really simple, but sometimes students just sort of write this paper out of their practice wisdom or their experience in the field. And I'm like, it's so easy just to throw in some citations in literature and just get those points for, section 1 or for the interview guide section. So what else are you all struggling with on this assignment that we can help you with?
So even for like the literature part, can it even be statistics?
Yes,
Okay.
exactly. So like a rationale often involve statistics related to prevalence. So like how, let's say you're doing something related to women who are coping with opioid use disorders. Like, what is the prevalence of opioid use disorders within female identifying clients? And like, what statistics do we have to support that this is a need? Or like maybe, sober living, you might want to look into percentages of females who are seeking services that have unstable housing. Or you could look at, the complex nature of women's lives and recovery have to do with the fact that, we are often providing care for children, and many residential treatment centers don't provide services for children or childcare or the ability for women to live with their children. So like, you're sort of developing that need based on literature that we know in the field.
So for me, I kind of like, I work at a skilled nursing facility where I had my BSW field placement, and I decided to focus on anxiety, like within residents, but it turns out that's one of like the lesser in research things. So I'm coming across like the issue where there's like information was just like older kind of. So I was just wondering, is it okay to like possibly use resources that don't have like nursing home or like skilled nursing facility like in the kind of research, and just kind of like generalize a little bit
Yeah.
possibly?
I'm trying to think about maybe how to best approach that. So I know that there is a robust literature around, skilled nursing and all different levels of care for older adults that has to do with anxiety and related to like medication management. So I know that's a really hot button issue within gerontology, is like over medication within facilities or within residential care. So you might want to look there, Dylan, to say, to like see if there is any overlap with anxiety and like prevalence of anxiety when people enter skilled nursing. And I imagine, people in skilled nursing are often recovering from surgeries and are like just coping with an entire new existence. So I imagine there's something there. I have had a few students reach out to me and say, like, I'm struggling with my literature review. Here are the topics. Here's my search function, or like, these are my keywords. And I like Brandon and I can help you find articles too, if you need any help with that. I also don't mind if you use older literature. I think some topics become really like hot button issues, let's say in the early aughts, and then they kind of fall off the radar, but that doesn't mean that they're not prevalent in like 2022. So you can talk about a limitation at the end as being like, I don't have any current literature, let's say in the past 10 years that I found to support this, to support my literature, but like, I'm just addressing that as a limitation.
Yeah, and sometimes it's just about knowing the right keywords to use when you're searching. Google Scholar is really good. And then if you don't have access through Google Scholar, you can always use the library and then type in the title of the article in the library and find it there. But yeah, Dr. Harris and I can absolutely help with just kind of using the right keywords to find articles. But I would imagine there's definitely research in the area of anxiety in nursing homes.
Yeah, there is. It was just, I found, I think like probably like 5, then the rest are from like 94, like 2002-ish, kind of older. So I was just kind of wondering if there's like flexibility with like the dates or anything for 10 years.
Yes, no, absolutely. And I would say typically students don't have more than like 5 or 6 citations for this paper. It's not, a very literature heavy paper. I just don't want you to have no literature. That's sort of a trend I've seen in the past. So if you can find 5 articles that support, the rationale that you need to focus on the needs of patients or residents that are coping with anxiety, yes, use those 5 articles.
Yeah, and like you were saying earlier, Dr. Harris, the trends kind of change sometimes. So maybe they used anxiety in the early 2000s and now they don't use that phrase anymore. And it's well-being or it's something different. It just might be categorized differently. Sometimes it's helpful to use just the cited by feature of Google Scholar, where you can look at an article and find out who else has cited that article. That's super helpful.
Yeah, a lot of you reach out to me and say, like, I've used X, Y, and Z, search function to find my literature. And I always go to Google Scholar first. For whatever reason, I just feel like I have the best luck there. With our proxy server with U of L that we're linked to, I tend to be able to access articles fairly easily, and they're sort of linked with our U of L system. And often I email authors, like if I can't get it directly and I'm just pressed on time and I'm waiting on the library or whatever, I'm having tech issues, I'll just reach out to the authors and say, like, I really would love a copy of this article. Would you mind sending it to me? I'm in this business, I want people to cite my work. So everybody wants their work cited. That's like the currency of academia. So they will be thrilled if you reach out to them.
I have a question.
Oh, sure. Go ahead, Abby.
Do we need to get like a formal written consent if we're going to interview a client?
No, not for this class. We do not require that. So because we really have these parameters that we don't want you to interview your own clients, we just usually have students tend to handle that through the organization. So kind of getting permission from your supervisor, if that makes sense. I've also had clients just email people that they know that, seek services, let's say for a number of different social services. So people have gotten access to interviewing clients in a number of different ways. But can you tell us what you were thinking about doing, Abby?
For my idea for the paper?
Yes, and the three people that you're thinking of interviewing.
Yeah, so I have not done my interviews yet, but I'm planning to interview case managers at the Salvation Army Veterans Program. I used to work there, so I kind of know a little bit about it, and I have connections with the people who were there. So I was going to interview like the director and a case manager and hopefully a client. Specifically regarding veterans, probably homeless veterans and substance abuse disorders, and their access to treatments.
Yeah, that sounds great. I mean, and if you talk to social worker there or whoever really kind of oversees services for clients, you might just want to talk through some of that with them prior to approaching a client to see if there's anything maybe within the organization that they want you to do. But for the sake of this course, since it's not technically formal research, it's just a program evaluation or assignment, you can really say that, the data that you're collecting is just really being used for a course assignment.
Okay, great. Thank you.
I have a question.
Oh, sure. Go ahead, Samantha.
So just the examples that I've heard is like some people are choosing to find programs that would help the clients. I was thinking more of I wanted to focus on burnout and secondary trauma of staff.
Yes.
And so one of the end goals of the need I was thinking would be some type of trauma-informed model within the agency. Is that appropriate?
Absolutely. And in fact, that's a really tight design for this. It's very clean in the sense that if you do a workforce-oriented study, let's say you interview 3 child welfare workers, and if you're thinking about implementation later on, you might want to think about interviewing 3 people that are all at the same level or do a similar kind of work. So sort of let's say you interview 3 people in child welfare that are in investigations, then you can really get a sense of what the specific needs are for the people that do that kind of work. And there's so much literature on the impact of secondary traumatic stress and burnout, compassion, fatigue amongst child welfare workers. Like that is a very clean, tight model to be able to do this. And then there's a lot of evidence-based practices that are linked to trauma-informed care that you can bring into later when thinking about, well, what would I want to do with, based on the needs? Is it like better employee wellness policies? Is it actually implementing, like, say, a mindfulness program at the organization? Is it linked to, people not being prepared for the job? So maybe it's better onboarding, better support for people, or better supervision throughout. So there's so many different ways you can go with it, but it's, I think the workforce program evaluations in this class have gone very successfully.
Okay, thank you. You gave me some good ideas.
You're welcome. Samantha, what kinds of populations of workers were you thinking about?
Well, so I work in residential, so I was just going to use the residential facility that I work at.
Yes. What workers I think are one of the most overlooked in terms of secondary traumatic stress are like the people that work on the floor, because they do not have a ton of, like, the mental health tech kind of roles. They do not have a lot of access to professional development. They don't have a lot of support, and they're underpaid for the work that they do. So like really high rates of burnout.
Yeah, that was kind of like what led me to do it, because I supervise, and there's not, like, for my team that works the floor, there's no opportunity, like, in terms of, like, they have to meet training hours, but then we also aren't allowed to, like, schedule them too much time off the floor because, like, they need to be with clients. And so I was like, I think that's what I'm going to do. So.
Yes. Oh, that would be so rich. Yes. Good. Any other questions, or just feel free to, like, workshop your ideas with us as well, or a challenge that you're facing or anything.
I don't know if this is even really a question, but it's something I've sort of been stumbling over, so I guess I'll throw it out there. So I've done 2 interviews so far, and my population of interest is adults with developmental disabilities. And something I'm running into in my interviews is the answer to a lot of my questions is, well, it depends on the condition. Because this population has a broad range of different conditions and different levels of functionality, I guess. I'm getting some weird looks when I ask questions, because they're like, well, what kind of a client are we talking about right now? Because there's such a broad range of them, if that makes sense.
Yes, and I know it's challenging because you've already completed 2 of the interviews. And Brandon and I are also happy to look at your notes too, to see if we can help you pull themes out. But I'm wondering if a good follow-up question when met with confusion is, well, it seems like there's a range. The needs are on a range or a continuum based on the conditions that people are living in. Can you give me 2 examples that would be like on the opposite ends of that range? And then you can kind of get a sense of, like, the body of clients that people are working with and, like, how the needs might differ.
So you're telling me to ask them for that. You're not asking me for 2 examples right now.
Right. I would say maybe ask them a follow-up question. If you're being met with, like, I don't even know how to answer that because my clients are so diverse and their needs are so, like, broad. I might say, well, can you give me both ends of that continuum? Like, what might that look like? And then maybe you could find the need within there. So it sounds like, Jared, are they unable to identify a common need among their clients?
I don't know if it's a common need. It's just, so with the population, I'm looking at sort of the right to self-determination / autonomy versus providing proper services and keeping them safe sort of continuum.
Yes.
And, you know, depending on the client, they just fall at different places on that scale, I guess. So does that make sense?
Yes. Are you finding that, so it's good though that you've identified two concerns. So like two almost like discourses within this milieu in a way. So like there is a concern with the social workers about the right to self-determination, but then there's also a concern with keeping clients safe. So in a way, you've already identified two themes.
Yeah.
And then from within that, you could kind of explicate your data and say, well, this is what different people are saying about these two themes. And maybe one of your findings is like, it depends on the condition. So here's, you know, social worker A giving an example of a condition where one might trope the other, or like they might be, one might be more essential than the other. Let's say in some cases, safety is like overrides some aspects of self-determination. But then in other cases, it might be the opposite, where we're leaning more towards autonomy over safety, depending on the conditions. That might be a really cool thing to write about in your themes.
Yeah, I'll try to come at it that way. Thanks.
And I always feel free to ask follow-up questions too to them if like they're not
Right.
yeah. Or you could also narrow down your participant population. I mean, that's another angle that you could go at, is like, if let's say they have identified a person coping with a certain condition, and like that way you can maybe narrow this down more of like, let's look at clients with this need that's linked to this condition.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, there's several different ways you could go.
All right, thanks.
So if I'm having a hard time contacting two people, actually all three people, my supervisor was out on COVID. And then the other two, they work for the same place, but they're not returning my calls. So Thursday and Friday, I have an opportunity to be at the actual corporate office for orientation for where my practicum is. So there's a bunch of resources in that building. Now, is it possible if I can't get a hold of these two people to switch them and just kind of, okay.
Yes, it sounds like not ideal, right? But for this assignment, the most important thing is you talk to three people. And sometimes it's not your three most ideal dream participants that can give you expert advice on this area. Sometimes it's like, I need three people willing to talk to me, and I'm just going to use this as a starting point. So yes, absolutely. If you can get three people, I've often seen students use a combination approach. Let's say you're getting really desperate and the time is tight and people aren't scheduling you for the interview, but I've also had students get really good luck in emailing their interview guide out and saying like, if we can do, a 30-minute interview and I can ask you these 10 questions, great. But if you do not have time, is there any way you might consider writing back a response to me? And sometimes too, if people see the interview guide ahead of time, they're like, oh, this is not what I imagined it to be. This isn't like, an hour-long deep dive into, all different aspects of the organization I work for, or my life story. It's just like pretty narrow. Sometimes it gets students better results.
That's such a great idea. I never even thought about emailing. So yeah, I might try that and see if I can. Yeah, because I really want to do these two people. And I know that once my supervisor comes back, I can talk to her, but yeah, emailing is such a good idea. Thank you.
Yes, of course. And let me know too, Kathleen, like just communicate early on with Brandon and I if you need an extension, because people are not, returning your phone calls. If you need an extra week, it's not the end of the world.
I appreciate that. Thank you.
course, of course. You know, these are really hard times to get interviews, especially with service provider, because people are so underwater and so short-staffed. Any other questions or ideas or things you're struggling with this paper?
I'd just like a generic one. If there like a certain point where we go past 7 pages, like if it's like 8.5, is that like 2 or 4 points off or
No,
something?
I just sort of like round it around 7. I actually, thank you for bringing this up, Dylan. I actually find this paper to be very challenging to write in 7 pages because it involves, you know, like you have to embed your interview guide, you have to embed some quotes from your participants. So if you need to go over, it's not the end of the world, like by a couple of pages. That's pretty typical, actually.
Oh yeah. So if it's like, because I did my interviews and I think I'm at like maybe almost 6 now. So I was just kind of like stressing about like crunching stuff back. So if it's like 8 pages or something, that would be fine, or like 8.5 or something.
Yes, that's fine. Yes. You know, the thing with this course is that, you know, Brandon and I want to see you succeed in this course. We are definitely not looking to like, you know, nickel and dime you for points. We want you to succeed. We tend to be very generous graders on this. Just follow the instructions and the outline. Use subheadings. I mean, that is such a big deal in terms of us being able to follow the organization of your, like, this is section 1, section 2, section 3, and use the same headings that are in the outline of the assignment with instructions so we can really follow along. You don't have to be a great writer, but if you're a great organizer, it gets you so far with writing so we can follow your ideas. That's what's so important. But yeah, we will not take off, you know, points for little things like that.
Right.
So you can go over.
Thank you.
Any other questions you all can think about? Or things that you're struggling with, or more examples that you want to process with us? Anything at all?
I think the biggest thing I'm struggling with right now is the actual questions I'm going to ask the 3 that would be my project partners.
Yeah. Christian, have you seen the example of the interview guide?
On Blackboard?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Does that fit for, if you were to fill in the blank in terms of your topic, does that help you think about or conceptualize getting at the need, or no? Because it doesn't always work for everybody.
Let me go back here and look at it really quick. I'm going to relook at it to make sure where it's the video and check it out and see if I can.
Email me too, Christian, because I can email it to you directly, because sometimes things, you know, get lost in the, I don't know, sessions, because there's so much posted in there. Because it's really like a fill in the blank that we found that gets at really broad questions that get our interview participants to talk about their needs.
So once I come up with my questions, can I email them to you guys to see if that?
Yes, of course. And I would say doing about 10 questions is typical.
Per person or all together?
I would say per person, but I would use the same interview guide across all participants. You might need to tweak it. Let's say if you interview a social worker and a client, but just a little bit. Like I had a student email me from your class, a really great interview guide, and she kind of had a pathway like for question 3, I'm going to phrase it this way when I interview the social worker, and I'm going to phrase it this way when I interview the client, but they're really getting at the same topic.
Okay.
Yeah. Any tips from classmates? So Jared's done interviews, Dylan's done interviews. What tips do you have for Christian about like questions that landed really well?
I asked a question towards the end of my last 2 interviews where I kind of stopped having like a focus or like any really specific zeroed in thing I was asking about, and just asked them, you know, for this population, what would you consider the ideal system of care to look like? I think is how I worded it. So just sort of an opportunity for them to share the thoughts that, you know, we all have ideas in our heads that we're hoping someone asks about. So just an opportunity for them to share those. I got a lot of good info out of that.
No, that's a perfect question, because the ideal world question is one that actually tells you a lot about their needs, because like what's missing from achieving that ideal world or ideal service provision. I've also had a lot of great luck asking questions. The needs assessment I'm currently working on, we say, if you could wave a magic wand and change one thing about the service, about your program currently, what would it be? And that tends to get a lot of a great response as well. I also like to ask questions on the opposite of that, like, you know, what are you most proud of about the program or the organization that you work for? I know that doesn't exactly get at the need, but I kind of like to ask those 2 questions back to back, like to assess what the person working at the organization thinks that they're doing really well. So what are you most proud of? And then I like to follow that up with, if you could wave a magic wand and change one thing about the services you're providing, what would it be?
Yeah, and both of those questions kind of connect on a personal level, so people are more apt to go further in depth with their response and kind of appreciate answering questions like that. So those are really good.
Yes,
Thank
so
you.
Brandon, I'm going to put a plug in for Brandon's video about interview guide development. He did a supplemental video. Do you want to tell us about it, Brandon?
Gosh, I don't even remember doing it anymore. Yeah, I didn't know that I would get to talk about this today. Yeah, so I did a program evaluation with a mental health provider in Michigan, and we were how much you want me to talk about this?
Yeah, go ahead, Brandon.
Well, I just wondering what would be helpful.
Just in terms, I think of like people that are still struggling with developing their interview guide questions, you know, what was helpful for you, and what interview questions do you find to like land really well or gather needed information?
Yeah, I mean, when I hear about like what questions do you really want to ask, I think very like off the top of my head, I think about barriers. That's a big one that I think people that are often thinking about what are the challenges that they face, and they're often experiences the challenges over and over. And you can approach barriers from a lot of different perspectives. So like in this case, when I was looking at a behavioral health clinic, we interviewed therapists providing services, and we also interviewed, you know, clients who were coming to receive services. And so if you ask the barriers to how therapists are offering services, it's going to be a completely different perspective from like if you're asking the clients what are their barriers to receiving the services. It's very interesting, the responses that you get. And we found that in this study that the therapists were in charge of calling all of the clients to say, hey, you have an appointment coming up this week. Are you going to make it? The reminder, which is kind of seems to me, I thought that was surprising that wasn't handled administratively. And we found that the therapists were mostly part-time employees that were working other jobs and were coming to this clinic kind of on almost a volunteer basis. And because of that, they weren't actually calling out the reminders on a consistent basis. And they were trying to kind of treating the clients in a way where they were disrespecting them. And clients weren't being reminded of their appointments. Just a very simple thing that we found out that people were just kind of dropping the ball on, which is very just disrespectful to the clients that they're intending to serve. But it was also done in a way that was very unintentional, and they didn't really see that that was a barrier to care. And also they didn't see it as their problem, as they didn't really feel like it was their responsibility to be making these phone calls initially. So we found that that's not really the fault of the therapists, but it's more of an executive level or top, because they probably shouldn't have been put in that position to make these reminders if they're already too busy. That was one thing.
Yeah, no, that's great too, because you had the challenge too of like you had two levels of data in the sense that you had social worker or therapist data, and then you had client data. And sometimes that's challenging because you're like melding together two different needs. It sounds like, the needs of the therapist were like, I don't actually have time to do this administrative task. And then the needs of the client were like, I actually need more respect. And so you're sort of trying to find a program that can really meld together both needs, but dealing with two different needs. And I think Jakira's here. Oh, sorry. So, sorry, that's a direct message. Welcome, Jakira. I'm so sorry. We have recorded this session and we've had a lot of great conversations. So I will definitely post it, and I can stay behind after with you as well. If you have any questions, we can work with you on your program evaluation. So I know we only have about 3 minutes left. Any final last burning questions about the needs assessment paper?
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay. Yes, I would love to talk with you afterwards. I'm on Central Standard Time and I completely forgot about the time difference. So it's 7:30 my time. I'm logging in right now.
No, do not worry. Yeah, we can stay after for sure. Do not worry about that.
Okay.
So I just want to say that it's not about the needs assessment, but like, I think this is a great idea. Just because for me, online learning, I feel very isolated from the class. And so like being able to see everybody's faces and having like conversations, interacting, I mean, you don't even know. It means so much to me because I have been struggling by being alone in this. But although your videos every week are great, I really appreciate that connection with you. But it is good to see everybody else too.
Yes.
So thank you.
Thank you for us too. And we will do one of these before every major assignment. So I usually try to do them 1 week out. So before our logic model, which is our next assignment, we'll schedule another one of these, and then we'll do that again for the program evaluation, which is your final assignment. Because I agree, it's hard for me to be an instructor online because you feel like you're sending information into the void. So I love connecting with you all as well.
Yeah, and I also have office hours on Tuesdays that everyone's welcome to pop into. I usually just sit there by myself. So
Wait, that's Tuesdays on 2 to 3, right?
yeah, 2 to 3, and I'm happy to meet with people at another time if that doesn't work. And I mean, I'd be really happy to help find some research or help with your putting together questions or help in any way. So
Yes,
Well,
I feel like, oh yes, Kathleen, anytime, because one thing, the trend, every cohort, every class is different. I have found that this class has not asked for phone calls or one-on-one meetings as much as my previous cohorts have. So do not be shy about trying to set up, 30-minute call, an hour-long call, even if it's outside of hours. With online instruction, we'll meet with people at night. I've met with students at 9 o'clock at night just because they work all day, and then they're in classes and that's the only time they can work on this assignment. So we are really, and there's 2 of us, which is awesome. So between both of us, we'll be able to meet with you.
yeah, we're working We're working all the time.
Yes,
We're on the clock.
we are.
I'm glad you all have clarified that and offered it because I've heard horror stories like when you enter your master's program, you just better know what you're doing, and that's it. That's all there is to it. So
No, we like to break it. We like to break these assignments down and also like to workshop your papers and ideas with you.
Yeah, every professor is different, but I think Dr. Harris and I are all about offering support. So
Yes. And this is the only class I'm teaching this semester, and Brandon as well. So we have time. All right, everyone. So I'm going to pause the recording. Let me try to find that. And I will post this for everyone who wasn't able to make it. And Jakir, if you want to stick behind, we can talk for a little while after this as well.
Yes, please.
Of course. All right. So for everyone else, it's so good to see your faces. And again, reach out to us at any point during the next week as you finalize your papers and interviews.
Okay, thank you so much.
All right, bye, everyone.
nice to see everyone.
Thank you.